Hey guys, tonight we begin with the utterly unfortunate fate of being an Aztec sacrifice victim. A role nobody auditioned for, but somehow thousands got cast in anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the Aztec Empire, you didn't sign up to be a sacrifice victim. There wasn't a volunteer box on any form, no pamphlet explaining the benefits, and definitely no severance package. This was a role you inherited through bad luck, bad timing, or bad geography. The easiest way to get picked was to be a captured warrior. Now, you might think that meant you fought badly, but in Aztec warfare, it was actually the opposite. If you fought bravely and skillfully, the enemy would rather keep you alive. Not because they liked you, but because you'd make an impressive gift to the gods. Essentially, you were a living trophy, just one that didn't get to sit on a shelf. Slaves could also be chosen, sometimes after being treated suspiciously well. You'd be given rich clothes, a diet far better than you'd ever had before, and maybe even paraded around as the living embodiment of a god. Sounds nice. Until you remember, the final act involves an obsidian blade and a lot of chanting. It was the ancient equivalent of being wined and dined before being politely escorted out of existence. And then there were the unlucky civilians. Strong, healthy, in the prime of life. Congratulations. You had the perfect resume for being ceremonially removed from the population. A job offer you couldn't refuse. From the outside, the role looked glamorous. You'd get fine garments, ceremonial jewelry, and an audience wherever you went. People might even look at you with admiration, though, let's be honest, part of that was relief that they weren't the one in your sandals. To the Aztecs, you were chosen for the highest honor, helping keep the sun moving across the sky. To you, it was more like winning the worst lottery in history. A jackpot that came with free meals, new clothes, and a guaranteed one-way trip to the top of the Great Temple. It was all part religious devotion, part public spectacle. Your final moments weren't just for the gods. They were for the crowd, the priests, and anyone in a neighboring city thinking about challenging Aztec power. In short, you were about to be famous, for about 2 minutes. Once you were chosen for sacrifice, the Aztecs made sure you knew it wasn't random. It was destiny. The gods, they said, had smiled upon you, which is a poetic way of saying you'd been hand-picked for an appointment you could never cancel. The Aztec worldview was built on reciprocity with the gods. The sun rose, the rains fell, and the corn grew because humans gave back. Not in coins or flowers, but in blood. Your blood. To them, this was the highest compliment. You were worthy of feeding the divine. To you, it was like being told you'd been selected as Employee of the Month, only to find out the reward was being ceremonially fired from life. Priests would remind you daily how special you were. They'd talk about how your spirit would ascend to the highest heavens, how the gods themselves would welcome you, and how your sacrifice would ensure the world didn't collapse into eternal darkness. It was touching, really. Except for the part where none of this changed the fact that you were on a countdown clock. Some chosen victims leaned into it. If you were already doomed, you might as well enjoy the perks, the richer food, the ceremonial drinks, the fact that you could say whatever you wanted without worrying about tomorrow, because, well, there wasn't going to be one. Others, however, had a harder time buying into the honor part. Being told you're special loses some sparkle when it comes from the same guy sharpening the obsidian blade. Your family might be proud, or at least pretend to be, because publicly questioning the ritual wasn't exactly safe. Neighbors would nod with solemn respect as you walked by, wearing fine clothes and painted in sacred patterns. But deep down, they were thinking, better him than me. To the outside world, you were now untouchable, revered, almost holy. In reality, you were the centerpiece in a grand performance that everyone was looking forward to. Except you. The priests called it a sacred duty. You might have called it a one-way promotion to the afterlife. Being special in the Aztec Empire had its perks, but as you'd soon find out, it also had a very sharp, very ceremonial downside. One of the strangest things about being chosen for sacrifice in the Aztec Empire was how well you were treated before the big day. It was almost suspicious. You went from ordinary life, whether as a captured warrior, a slave, or a citizen, to what could only be described as the ancient equivalent of an all-inclusive resort. Suddenly, you were fed rich, flavorful meals. None of the bland maize porridge you might have been used to. We're talking tamales, fresh fruit, maybe even cacao drinks. Food normally reserved for nobility. Your clothes upgraded too. No more worn tunics. Now you wore fine cotton garments, dyed in bright colours and decorated with intricate patterns. You might even get jewellery. It was all very flattering, right up until you remembered why they were doing it. The reason was simple. Appearances mattered. You weren't just any sacrifice. You were a gift to the gods, and a shabby offering would be insulting. Think of it like wrapping a present in gold foil before handing it over, except in this case, you were the present. Some victims enjoyed the experience while it lasted. After all, it's hard not to appreciate good food, comfortable clothing, and the sudden interest everyone takes in you. You might even be given ceremonial tasks, singing, dancing, or appearing in processions as part of the festival build-up. Of course, the VIP part had limits. You couldn't exactly leave, and your schedule was not your own. Priests checked on you regularly, not because they were concerned for your well-being, but because losing you before the ceremony would ruin the program. You were essentially a walking, talking centerpiece that had to be kept in perfect condition until showtime. The public, meanwhile, would see you pass and whisper about how honored you must feel. They'd point out your fine clothes, your confident walk, and the fact that you were treated like nobility. Few mentioned the obvious, that all of this was temporary, very temporary. The Aztecs believed the gods deserved the best, so for a little while, you were the best. You ate like a noble, dressed like a noble, and were paraded like a noble. The only difference was that actual nobles got to keep enjoying those things after the festival. You, on the other hand, were on borrowed luxury, and the due date was approaching fast. As the festival approached, your VIP makeover wasn't complete without one final touch, the ceremonial body paint. The Aztecs took this seriously. You weren't just getting a few stripes and swirls. This was a full-on transformation into a walking piece of religious art. The priests would carefully paint your face and body with symbolic designs. Each colour and pattern meant something. Red for the rising sun, black for the underworld, white for death, and so on. Sometimes, they'd paint you to resemble a specific god you were meant to stand in for during the ceremony. This wasn't a casual face paint job from a village fair. This was sacred, deliberate, and done with pigments so vivid they'd probably still be visible after your final scene. To the crowd, these patterns weren't just decoration. They were a clear announcement. Here is the honoured sacrifice. In other words, the ancient equivalent of walking around with a giant neon sign saying main event. You couldn't blend in even if you wanted to. The process itself was surprisingly meticulous. You'd be seated or stood in a special area while the priests mixed the pigments from minerals, plants, and even insects. Yes, some of the most brilliant colours came from crushed bugs. It was all very creative, if a bit unsettling to realise your glowing red arm was courtesy of beetle powder. Once painted, you became part of the festival's visual spectacle. Children would point, elders would nod approvingly. Strangers might offer you flowers or food, partly out of respect and partly out of the belief that it was good luck to give a gift to someone destined for the gods. Of course, there was a double edge to all of this. The paint was meant to elevate you spiritually, but it also removed any last trace of anonymity. Not that you had much before, but now there was no mistaking you for an innocent bystander. You were a marked person in every sense. Still, there was something strangely empowering about it. You'd been chosen, dressed, fed, and now turned into a living symbol. It was pageantry at its finest, just with a slightly fatal ending. The Aztecs believed the gods would recognize you instantly when the time came. Unfortunately, so would everyone else. If you thought the morning of your sacrifice might at least start off peacefully, you'd be wrong. There was no gentle sunrise and birdsong to ease you into your last day. Instead, you woke up to the deep, pounding beat of ceremonial drums echoing across the city. And these weren't background drums. They were the kind of drums that made your chest vibrate and reminded you that, yes, you had an appointment on the great temple steps in just a few hours. The drums weren't there for your benefit. They were for everyone else. A signal to the city that the festival had begun, that the gods were about to be honoured, and that all eyes should be on the ceremonial proceedings. Of course, they also worked as an excellent alarm clock for the guest of honour. No hitting snooze here. Priests would arrive early to check on you. They'd offer food, perhaps some ritual drinks, and a final round of ceremonial blessings. It might almost feel comforting if it weren't for the subtle tension in the air. These weren't casual morning greetings. These were the last-minute rituals to prepare you for your starring role. By now, you were fully dressed in your ceremonial garments, adorned with feathers, jewellery, and freshly touched-up paint. The air smelled of incense, flowers, and anticipation. Somewhere nearby, other participants were also getting ready. Dancers, musicians, and fellow victims, each with their own assigned moment in the ceremony. As the drums grew louder, the atmosphere shifted from morning calm to public spectacle. The city came alive. People gathered in the plazas, climbing onto rooftops for a better view. Merchants sold festival foods. Children darted between the crowds, trying to catch glimpses of the preparations. The excitement was palpable, though you, of course, were experiencing a different kind of thrill. And here's the thing. The Aztecs genuinely believed this was a good day for you. They thought you were stepping into eternal honour, joining the gods in the afterlife. So when the priests looked at you and smiled, it wasn't sarcasm. They meant it. The reality? Your morning was less preparing for glory and more final boarding call. The drums didn't just mark the start of the festival. They were the countdown clock you couldn't ignore. After the drums had done their job of reminding you that this was, in fact, your final day, it was time for the next act, the ceremonial procession. This was not a subtle, slip-in through the side entrance type of affair. No, you were front and centre in a parade designed to make sure the entire city knew exactly who the main event was. Priests led the way, their robes flowing, incense burners swinging in slow arcs, filling the air with fragrant smoke. Behind them came dancers in feathered costumes, musicians with flutes and rattles, and attendants carrying banners. And then there was you, painted, dressed, and walking in the middle of the grand parade like an honoured dignitary, whose tenure was about to end abruptly. People lined the streets to watch. Some shouted blessings, some offered flowers, and a few probably made wagers about how composed you'd look on the altar. Children pointed with wide-eyed fascination. Elders nodded gravely. Merchants closed their stalls just to see you pass. It was a spectacle, and you were the star, even if you'd have preferred a less dramatic role. The procession wound its way through the main plaza, ensuring that as many people as possible got a good look at you. In a way, it was the Aztec version of a farewell tour, except instead of signing autographs, you were receiving ceremonial offerings. Every step was accompanied by music, pounding drums, piercing flutes, and the occasional cheer from the crowd. The noise was constant, impossible to ignore. It was meant to energize the festival, but it also made it impossible to pretend this was just another religious service. As you approached the base of the great temple, the crowd grew denser, and the anticipation thicker. You could see the steep steps ahead, rising toward the altar. The music swelled. The smell of incense was almost overwhelming now. This was the moment the parade transitioned into something else, the climb. The strange thing was, everyone watching truly believed this was an honour. They weren't